Wealth transfers don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with a press release from the Federal Reserve or a front-page headline in the Financial Times. They don't come with a countdown clock or a signal flare visible to everyone simultaneously. They arrive quietly, in capital flow data, in asset pricing divergences, in the gap between what institutions are doing and what the public narrative is describing, in the slow accumulation of positioning decisions made by the most informed capital managers in the world, decisions that collectively constitute a transfer of wealth from one group to another, months or years before the broader public processes what is happening. In 2008, the transfer was visible in retrospect. The institutions that had liquidity, that had not overextended, that had built cash reserves rather than leveraged positions, bought distressed assets at crisis prices from the institutions that had to sell. Warren Buffett lent Goldman Sachs $5 billion at 10% with warrants. He lent General Electric $3 billion at 10%. Those deals were not charitable. They were the extraction of maximum value by the party with liquidity from the party without it. The terms were dictated, not negotiated. The gap between those who moved early and those who moved late was measured in hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth transfer. What is happening now is not a single shock event like 2008. It is more insidious than that. It is a structural process. Multiple simultaneous shifts in asset pricing, in capital access, in technology-driven productivity concentration, in institutional repositioning, that are moving wealth from one group to another continuously, incrementally, in ways that will only become obvious to most people when the assets that reflect the transfer are already priced to reflect it. This is Capital Briefing. If you are here for the first time, subscribe now before we continue. Turn on notifications. What we build on this channel is the translation of structural, macro, and financial shifts into the framework that lets you understand what is happening before the public narrative absorbs it. The gap between when structural shifts begin and when they become common knowledge is exactly where the most consequential positioning decisions get made. Subscribe now. Then let me show you the 4 vectors through which this wealth transfer is currently operating. Vector 1. The housing market has become a generational wealth sorting mechanism, and the sorting is already complete. The data is not ambiguous. The National Association of Home Builders reported in February 2026 that home prices have risen 53% since 2019, while median household income has risen only 24% over the same period. The ratio of home prices to income has deteriorated at a pace not seen in modern housing market history. The St. Louis Federal Reserve published a study in February 2026 documenting the long-run version of this divergence. From 2000 to 2024, median per capita income grew approximately 155% in nominal terms. Median home prices grew approximately 207%. That gap, 52 percentage points of nominal divergence over 24 years, represents the accumulated transfer of housing wealth from those who entered the market after 2000 to those who entered it before. The implication is structural and generational. People who owned homes before 2000 or before 2010 or even before 2019 saw their primary asset appreciate at rates that far outpaced their wages, their savings, and their other financial accumulation. They became wealthier in a way that required no labor, no skill, no additional investment. Simply existing in the right asset class at the right time transferred purchasing power to them from future buyers. People attempting to enter the housing market in 2026 face prices 5 times the median household income, with 30-year fixed mortgage rates averaging 6 to 7%, with down payment requirements that represent multiple years of after-tax income. The affordability trap is not a cyclical problem that will resolve when rates fall slightly. It is a structural condition that has been decades in the making, the cumulative consequence of asset price inflation running persistently faster than wage growth. This is not abstract. Every year that someone who owns a home gains equity while someone who rents does not is a year of wealth transfer, from labor income to asset ownership, from renters to owners, from the young to those who entered the market earlier. The transfer is not happening in a single dramatic moment, it is happening continuously. And it has been happening for long enough that the gap has become generational. Subscribe to Capital Briefing if this framing is delivering the structural context you have been looking for. Turn on notifications. The next video on this channel examines what specific portfolio architecture makes sense for someone attempting to build wealth in an environment where traditional asset classes like housing have already undergone significant price transfers, and what access to private market instruments means for the math of long-term wealth accumulation. Subscribe now. Then to Vector 2. Vector 2. AI investment is concentrating economic value at the infrastructure layer, and most public investors cannot access it. In March 2026, Investor Place published a piece with a title that is more important than the article itself: The Hidden Wealth Transfer Inside the AI Revolution. That phrase, hidden wealth transfer, captures something that is structurally accurate and almost completely absent from mainstream financial commentary. The AI build-out is not a rising tide that lifts all boats. It is a massive concentration of capital investment at a specific layer of the economic stack, the infrastructure layer, where the economic value of the AI transition is being captured by a small number of entities. The data is explicit. AI investment is projected to exceed $500 billion in 2026. Data center build-out alone is adding 10 to 20 basis points to US GDP growth. A small group of AI companies accounted for more than half of S&P 500 returns and approximately one-third of global equity gains as of October 2025. One-third of global equity gains from a handful of companies. The concentration is not random. It follows a structural logic that analysts have described as the AI enclosure, a parallel to the historical enclosure of common land during the Industrial Revolution. Just as the enclosure of common agricultural land transferred productive capacity from dispersed smallholders to large landowners who could exploit it more efficiently, the AI build-out is concentrating control over cognitive labor capacity in the entities that control the infrastructure: semiconductor manufacturers, hyperscalers, data center operators, power infrastructure providers. The entity that controls the compute controls the value. But here is the element that the public narrative almost never discusses explicitly. The companies at the infrastructure layer of the AI economy, the ones capturing the largest share of economic value from the transition, are not primarily accessible through public equity markets at attractive valuations. They are already priced to reflect institutional awareness of their strategic position. The deeper access to early-stage infrastructure plays, to private credit financing the build-out, to direct investment in the energy and logistics infrastructure that AI depends on, exists primarily in private markets. Family offices and institutional investors with access to private equity, private credit, and direct deals are positioning in the AI build-out at stages and at terms that public market investors cannot access. This is not a complaint about fairness. It is a description of how the financial architecture of the AI transition is distributing the economic value of that transition. Those with private market access position early at private valuations, with terms that reflect information advantages. Public market investors access the same companies later at public valuations, with terms set by the market after the institutional premium has already been established. The access gap is a wealth transfer mechanism. It has always been this way. What is different about the AI transition is the scale. Vector 3. Inflation has functioned as a hidden tax on labor income while amplifying returns for asset holders, and the divergence is accelerating. This is the vector that is most felt and least understood. The inflation episode of 2021 to 2024 did not affect all households equally. It was, by its mechanical nature, a transfer of purchasing power from those who hold primarily financial claims denominated in nominal terms, wages, salaries, savings accounts, fixed income, to those who hold real assets, real estate, equities, commodities, private businesses whose nominal values can adjust upward with inflation. The Federal Reserve's asset purchases between 2008 and 2022 which expanded its balance sheet from less than $1 trillion to nearly $9 trillion, inflated every asset class simultaneously. The mechanism is straightforward. When money is cheap, asset prices rise. The people who owned assets when money became cheap became wealthier. The people who didn't own assets, who held their savings in cash, in savings accounts, in money market instruments, watched the purchasing power of those savings decline relative to the assets they could not afford. The top 1% share of household net worth has increased dramatically since 1989. The bottom 50% share has declined. The divergence tracks almost precisely with the expansion of central bank balance sheets and the periods of sustained asset price inflation. This is not an accident of markets. It is the mechanical consequence of monetary policy that inflates asset values faster than it inflates wages. The inflation creates wealth for asset holders. The inflation is then partially expressed in wage increases, but the wage increases arrive with a lag, do not fully compensate for the purchasing power loss, and do not give wage earners access to the repriced assets they were already priced out of. Inflation-adjusted real wages for young college graduates have been largely stagnant for 2 decades, a documented finding published by multiple Federal Reserve research departments. A college degree, once the pathway to economic security, has not guaranteed meaningful real wage growth for an entire generation. Meanwhile, the assets that would have provided the inflation protection, housing, equities, private market investments, have repriced to levels that make entry on labor income alone increasingly difficult. The structure creates a self-reinforcing loop. Assets appreciate. Wage earners cannot access the appreciated assets. More quantitative easing inflates assets further. The gap widens. Vector 4. Private market access is becoming the defining dividing line in wealth accumulation, and the gap is institutionalizing. This is the vector that most directly connects the other 3. Family offices, the most sophisticated private wealth management structures, now hold 54% of their portfolios in alternative assets. Private credit has become the fastest-growing allocation category, with 32% of family offices increasing allocations in 2025 and 2026. Private equity and direct deals constitute the core of how the wealthiest families in the world are currently building wealth. These allocations have access characteristics that fundamentally differ from public markets. Private credit, loans made directly to businesses by private lenders, offers yields in the range of 8 to 12%. Senior secured positions in capital structures, returns that have historically been less correlated with public equity volatility. Access to this asset class requires minimum investments of hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. It is structurally inaccessible to retail investors. Private equity at the direct deal level, acquiring stakes in businesses at negotiated prices with governance rights, offers return profiles that public equity cannot match because the entry pricing occurs before public market pricing. The wealth creation happens before the asset goes public. Infrastructure investments tied to the AI build-out, to energy transition, to logistics modernization. These are being captured primarily at the institutional and family office level, before the pricing reflects public awareness. The wealth management industry is explicit about this. MSCI's 2026 Wealth Trends Report documents that about 98% of advisors say new high net worth portfolios now include some level of customization. Private credit and private equity are increasingly viewed as essential components, potentially offering diversification benefits and lower correlation to public equities. What this means in practice, the portfolios of wealthy families are becoming structurally different from the portfolios of everyone else, not just in size, but in kind, in the specific instruments held, in the access those instruments provide, in the return profiles they generate. As the gap between private market returns and public market returns compounds over years, the wealth differential grows, not through any single dramatic event, but through the steady accumulation of return differential between portfolios that have private access and those that do not. Let me now explain the historical parallel that makes this moment recognizable to anyone who studies long-run wealth distribution patterns. The Industrial Revolution provides the cleanest historical analogy. Between 1760 and 1850 approximately, the economic structure of Britain was transformed by industrialization. The transformation created enormous wealth, more total economic output, more total productivity, more goods at lower prices. The aggregate statistics looked positive, but the distribution of that new wealth was highly concentrated. The factory owners, the financiers who provided capital to them, the landowners whose resources were consumed in the industrialization. These groups captured the vast majority of the economic gains from the transformation. The workers whose labor powered the factories experienced decades of wage stagnation, deteriorating living conditions, and increasing economic insecurity, even as the aggregate economy grew rapidly. The mechanism was access and timing. Those who controlled capital when the transformation began could position in the productive infrastructure of the new economy. Those who only had labor income could not. AI is being described explicitly by multiple analysts in 2026 as the equivalent structural transformation. The comparison to the Industrial Revolution, the AI enclosure parallel, is being made by serious financial analysts at serious institutions. The difference from the Industrial Revolution is that the current transformation is happening faster. The concentration of value at the infrastructure layer is occurring in years, not decades. The gap between early institutional positioning and public awareness is being compressed, which means the window to position for the structural shift is shorter. Let me now address directly the question that everyone watching this should be asking. What does this actually mean for someone who is not a family office, not an institutional investor, not already wealthy? The honest answer has two parts. The first part is uncomfortable. Many of the most direct expressions of the current wealth transfer, private credit at institutional terms, direct infrastructure investments, early-stage AI infrastructure equity, are genuinely inaccessible at small scale. The access barriers are real. Pretending they are not is not useful. The second part is more actionable. The vectors through which this transfer is operating are identifiable. And identifiability creates the possibility of positioning, not necessarily in the most direct instruments, but in ways that align with the direction of the structural shift. Housing. The transfer within housing has largely already occurred between homeowners and non-owners, but the implications of that transfer, sustained high mortgage rates, structural affordability constraints, continued rent pressure, create positioning considerations for anyone thinking about their long-term financial architecture. AI concentration. Public market access to the infrastructure layer of the AI transition is available, even if at post-premium prices. Understanding which companies sit at the energy, semiconductor, and data infrastructure choke points of the AI build-out is a more informed position than broad market exposure. Inflation. The lesson of the 2021 to 2024 inflation episode, that nominal financial instruments lose purchasing power while real assets gain, is applicable to portfolio construction even at small scale. Inflation-protected instruments, commodity exposure, equity ownership of businesses with pricing power, these are accessible. Private market access. The barriers are higher, but not absolute. The expanding range of semi-liquid private market structures, interval funds, and broader distribution channels for private credit is making fractional access increasingly available. It is not the same as institutional terms, but it is directionally aligned with where the return premium is being generated. The wealth transfer is operating whether or not any individual positions for it. The question is not whether to participate in the transfer. It is whether to be on the receiving side or the paying side. Those who own real assets when inflation rises are on the receiving side. Those who hold only nominal financial claims are on the paying side. Those who have exposure to the AI infrastructure build are on the receiving side. Those who have only exposure to the industries being disrupted are on the paying side. Those who access private market returns compound on the receiving side over years. Those who have only public market access pay the established premium on the receiving side's positioning. The transfer is structural. The directions are identifiable. The window for positioning is earlier than most people realize, because by the time the transfer is the subject of mainstream financial commentary, the early premium has already been captured. Let me close with the observation that I believe captures the entire psychology of why most people are late to every major wealth transfer. The biggest financial shifts are usually invisible to the public until the pricing has already changed, not because the information is hidden, not because the signals are absent, but because the human tendency is to interpret the present through the framework of the recent past, to assume that the conditions that existed for the last 5 or 10 years will continue, to treat the status quo as permanent infrastructure rather than as a temporary state that is actively being changed by forces that are already in motion. In 2006, the housing market was obviously overextended to anyone looking at price-to-income ratios or loan origination standards. But the vast majority of participants continued to behave as though prices would keep rising because they had kept rising. In 2020 and 2021, the inflation was visible in money supply data before it appeared in consumer prices. The institutions that positioned for inflation early captured the repricing. The public accepted the transitory narrative until prices were already up 15%. The current transfer has multiple identifiable vectors. The data is public. The institutional behavior is documented. The historical parallels are clear. Most people are late because they are waiting for certainty before acting, and certainty arrives when the transfer is already priced. Subscribe to Capital Briefing now if this video changed how you think about the structural nature of the current wealth transfer and the vectors through which it is operating. Turn on notifications, leave one comment, one honest answer. Of the 4 vectors described in this video, housing, AI concentration, inflation asymmetry, and private market access, which one do you think is most underappreciated by the people around you? Because the wealth transfer is already underway. The question is only whether you see it.